The street was 40 meters wide and 300 meters long, a straight corridor between the rusted walls of factory buildings that had not operated since the fighting reached this industrial district of eastern Ukraine. For a Russian armored column attempting to push through toward Ukrainian positions beyond the factory complex, it looked like an opportunity, a direct route. Hard surfaces for tracked vehicles, cover from overhead observation from the factory walls on both sides. Ukrainian FPV operators had been waiting in those walls for 2 days. Days ago, Russian forces launched a combined arms push through the industrial district, infantry and armor moving together through the factory streets, attempting to use the hard cover of the buildings to reach Ukrainian defensive positions on the far side of the complex before Ukrainian artillery could effectively engage them in the confined urban terrain. It was a tactically coherent approach. In the industrial zones of eastern Ukraine, the factory buildings provide Russian forces with cover from the longer-range Ukrainian fires that dominate the open ground outside urban areas. Moving through the built environment reduces Ukrainian standoff advantage and forces Ukrainian defenders into close-range engagements where Russian numerical and armor advantages are supposed to matter more. Ukrainian defenders had prepared for exactly this. And in the factory streets of an industrial district, on a cold April morning, they demonstrated that in the urban terrain of eastern Ukraine, the numerical and armor advantages that Russian commanders were counting on had been replaced by something else entirely. The intelligence picture that preceded this engagement had been developing for several days. Ukrainian observation of Russian force positioning in the area beyond the industrial district indicated a concentration of infantry and armor consistent with an urban assault preparation. The specific formation, infantry carriers forward, dismounted infantry screening for IED threats, main battle tanks following at intervals, was a pattern that Ukrainian analysts had seen in previous Russian urban assault preparations, and that indicated a route clearance and exploitation sequence designed for movement through confined built-up terrain. Ukrainian defensive preparation in the industrial district began immediately. The factory complex that Russian forces were preparing to push through had been part of Ukrainian defensive planning for weeks. Not because Ukrainian commanders had predicted this specific assault, but because the urban terrain of the industrial district was an obvious potential Russian approach, and Ukrainian planners had developed defensive schemes for it as part of the routine preparation of the entire defensive sector. The preparation that was activated when Russian intent became clear was therefore not built from scratch. It was a pre-existing plan that was staffed, equipped, and refined in the days before Russian forces moved. Ukrainian FPV drone operators established positions inside the factory buildings at multiple points along the expected Russian approach routes. The factory buildings provided what military planners call dominant urban terrain. Elevated positions with observation and fields of fire along the street corridors, cover and concealment from outside the buildings, and the structural hardness of industrial construction that provides meaningful protection against small arms fire. Ukrainian operators moved into those positions carefully, minimizing their signature and avoiding creating observable changes to the exterior of the buildings that Russian reconnaissance might detect. The FPV positions were not the only element of the Ukrainian defensive preparation. Ukrainian infantry teams occupied fighting positions at the ends of the approach corridors. The points where a Russian column that had pushed through the factory street would emerge into Ukrainian-controlled ground. Ukrainian anti-tank teams were positioned at angles that allowed engagement of armor in the street corridor from oblique directions, sides and rear aspects of Russian vehicles that their frontal armor is not designed to protect. Ukrainian artillery, unable to engage effectively in the confined streets without risk to the factory structures and the Ukrainian positions inside them, was pre-registered against the approaches to the industrial district and the open areas beyond it where Russian forces would concentrate before entering. The Ukrainian FPV operators, who took up their positions inside the factory buildings, had studied the terrain with a level of detail that only direct physical presence provides. They knew the width of each street. They knew where the road surface was broken and where vehicles would slow. They knew which gate openings between factory compounds provided angles onto the main street that an approaching Russian vehicle commander would not expect to cover. They knew the distances, the ranges from their positions to each significant point along the approach corridor, because they had measured them. When Russian vehicles entered the corridor, Ukrainian operators would not be estimating ranges. They would be working from confirmed data. The Russian assault began in the pre-dawn hours. Infantry dismounts moved forward first, checking the street entrances and the near buildings for Ukrainian forward positions. Finding none, the Ukrainian operators inside the factory buildings had positioned themselves far enough from the street-level openings to avoid detection during this forward clearance phase. The Russian infantry signaled for the armor to follow. The lead vehicle entered the street corridor, a T-72, its commander in the turret scanning the factory walls with a thermal sight that was looking for the heat signatures of Ukrainian defenders in the windows and doorways of the buildings. Ukrainian FPV operators, watching through their own thermal-capable systems from positions inside the buildings, held their fire. The lead T-72 was allowed to advance to the point that Ukrainian planners had designated as the forward limit of the kill zone, the point past which the tank would be too close to the Ukrainian infantry positions at the corridor exit for an FPV engagement to be safely conducted. At that point, the first drone launched. The drone flew from a second-floor opening in the factory wall on the T-72's right side, an approach angle that the tank commander's thermal scan was not covering at the moment of launch. The FPV operator flew the drone in a low, fast approach along the wall face before angling into the tank's right flank. The strike hit the tank at the junction of the turret and the hull, a point of structural vulnerability that Ukrainian FPV operators who have studied Russian armor have learned to target. The T-72 stopped. Secondary fires began from the engine compartment. The street was now 40 meters wide and partially blocked by a burning tank. The Russian vehicles behind it, two BMP infantry carriers with dismounts on their decks, had approximately 4 seconds to assess the situation before the second and third drones launched simultaneously from different positions in the factory buildings. The second drone targeted the lead BMP from directly ahead, flying through the smoke of the burning T-72 at low altitude, under the visual threshold of the BMP crew, attempting to observe the source of the first attack. The third drone flew from the opposite side of the street, targeting the second BMP from its left flank. Both strikes landed within seconds of each other. Both BMPs stopped. Russian dismounts, who had been riding on the vehicle decks, infantry, who had been positioned for rapid dismount and assault once the armor reached the corridor exit, were caught by the simultaneous vehicle strikes. Those who were not immediately casualties by the explosions found themselves dismounted in the middle of a 40-meter-wide street in an industrial corridor with no cover except the burning vehicles that were producing the smoke now filling the approaches, with Ukrainian infantry positions at both ends of the corridor now engaging them with direct fire. The Russian infantry component of the assault, the soldiers who had screened forward before the armor entered, was now separated from its vehicles and its fire support, caught between the burning armor in the corridor and the Ukrainian infantry engagement from the far end. The factory buildings on both sides were producing drone fire from positions that Russian infantry could not effectively suppress with small arms. Attempting to enter the buildings to eliminate the drone operators meant moving off the street surface into the factory interiors, a movement that Ukrainian defenders had anticipated and that Ukrainian infantry positions inside the buildings were prepared to contest. The assault collapsed. Russian commanders, monitoring the engagement from their command element outside the industrial district, attempted to push additional vehicles into the street to exploit any gap that surviving infantry might have created. The additional vehicles, a second T-72 and an additional BMP that entered the corridor from the original approach, were engaged by FPV drones that had not yet been committed, and by Ukrainian anti-tank teams positioned at the oblique angles that the corridor geometry provided. The second T-72 was struck and disabled before it reached the burning hulk of the first. The additional BMP reversed out of the corridor after the anti-tank engagement and was subsequently caught by artillery as it attempted to withdraw through the open approach area. Russian forces that had entered the industrial district on foot, the infantry element that had been screening ahead of the armor, found themselves isolated when the armor push failed. Without vehicle support, without the fire superiority that the combined arms team was supposed to provide, the infantry was not capable of continuing the assault against prepared Ukrainian positions in the factory buildings. The surviving Russian infantry withdrew, using the factory wall corners and vehicle hulks for cover against Ukrainian fires, back through the approach corridor and out of the industrial district. The industrial district remained in Ukrainian hands. The Russian push had not taken a single building. Now let us examine the material cost of what Russia lost in this engagement. The T-72 main battle tank destroyed in the initial FPV strike, the vehicle that blocked the corridor and transformed the street from a movement route into a kill zone, carries a replacement cost of $3.5 to $4.5 million USD under current Russian production conditions. Its loss was not simply the loss of a vehicle. It was the loss of the mobility and fire support capability that the assault depended on, at the moment when that capability was most needed. The tank that was supposed to lead the breakthrough became the obstacle that prevented it. The two BMP infantry carriers destroyed in the simultaneous follow-on strikes, $1.8 to $2.2 million each, for a combined $3.6 to $4.4 million. The additional BMP subsequently caught by artillery outside the industrial district, another $1.8 to $2.2 million. The second T-72 disabled in the corridor, $3.5 to $4.5 million. Total direct vehicle losses, $14.2 to $19.8 million USD. Infantry casualties among the dismounts caught in the corridor, and the assault element that was isolated when the armor failed represent a personnel loss that, while not reducible to a simple dollar figure, degrades Russian assault capability in the sector in ways that replacement personnel cannot quickly remedy. Urban assault is a skill-intensive activity. The coordination between dismounted infantry and armor in confined terrain, the movement techniques for clearing buildings under fire, the judgment required to manage the unpredictable close-range engagements that urban combat produces, requires training and experience that is particularly hard to replicate under wartime conditions. The operational cost compounds the materiel loss. Russian commanders attempting to push through the industrial district now face a terrain problem that has been made significantly more difficult by the visible evidence of what happened to the first assault. Burned vehicles blocking the approach corridors, a Ukrainian defensive system that has demonstrated its capability to defeat armored urban assault, and an infantry element that experienced the failure of the combined arms approach firsthand and will approach the next attempt with the psychological weight of that experience. Ukrainian FPV operators held positions inside factory buildings for 2 days before Russian forces arrived. Ukrainian infantry positioned at corridor exits, anti-tank teams at oblique angles, artillery pre-registered on approaches. Each element was in place before the first Russian vehicle entered the street. The assault that Russian commanders had planned as a controlled advance through terrain they expected to provide them cover was, from the moment the lead T-72 entered the corridor, an engagement that Ukrainian defenders had already won. The factory buildings of eastern Ukraine are cold in April. The floors are hard. The waiting is long. Ukrainian operators sat in those buildings for 2 days, knowing that Russian armor was coming and knowing that, when it arrived, they would have one chance to execute the defensive plan that Ukrainian commanders had built for exactly this terrain and exactly this threat. They executed it perfectly. The lead tank burned, the corridor closed, the assault ended. Ukrainian drone operators held the factory walls. Ukrainian defenders held the district. And the Russian column that was supposed to push through to Ukrainian positions beyond the industrial complex never got past the first 40 meters of a 300-meter street. Ukraine holds the walls. Ukraine holds the streets. Ukraine holds the ground. To fully understand what happened in that industrial corridor, it is necessary to examine the specific challenge that urban terrain presents to the combined arms approach that Russian forces have been attempting to use throughout the Eastern Front, and why the industrial districts of eastern Ukraine have become places where that approach consistently fails against Ukrainian defenders who have learned to use the terrain. Russian armored doctrine is built around the combined arms team, tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineering operating in coordination to suppress, fix, and destroy defensive elements while maintaining the momentum of the advance. In open terrain, fields, gradual slopes, the agricultural landscape that dominates much of eastern Ukraine outside the urban areas, this doctrine functions as designed when Russian forces can bring their numerical and firepower advantages to bear at ranges where their systems perform well and where Ukrainian anti-armor systems must expose themselves to engage. Urban terrain, and specifically the industrial urban terrain of factory districts in eastern Ukraine, negates several of the key advantages that Russian combined arms doctrine relies on. Artillery cannot effectively engage targets inside the factory buildings without destroying the structures that provide cover to both sides. The direct line-of-sight engagement ranges that artillery observers need to call effective fire are blocked by building walls. The standoff distances that Russian tanks use to engage Ukrainian positions with main gunfire are compressed to the width of factory streets, 40 to 60 meters, where a tank's targeting system and its crew's reaction time provide minimal advantage over an FPV drone approaching at high speed from an angle the tank commander was not watching. And the factory buildings themselves. The specific architectural character of Soviet-era heavy industrial construction, with thick reinforced concrete walls, multiple floors, interior spaces that allow movement between positions without exposure to street-level observation, and structural hardness that resists small arms fire, are ideally suited for the defensive employment of small Ukrainian teams with FPV drones. A Ukrainian FPV operator, positioned inside a factory building on the second or third floor, can observe an approaching vehicle in the street below, launch a drone from an interior position, fly it to a window or opening, and engage the vehicle from an angle that the vehicle crew is not covering, all without ever exposing themselves to direct fire from the street. This is what Ukrainian operators did in this engagement. And what makes their performance in this specific engagement notable is not that they executed a tactically sound approach. That is what they trained to do. What is notable is the degree of terrain preparation and intelligence work that preceded the execution, and the discipline with which a defensive plan was held until the moment it could achieve maximum effect. The 2 days that Ukrainian FPV operators spent in those factory buildings before Russian forces arrived were not passive waiting. They were active preparation. Operators walked the interior spaces of the buildings, identifying the specific openings, windows, and gaps in the factory walls that provided the approach angles they would need for drone employment. They measured distances to points along the street corridor, the window opening to the corner of the adjacent building, the gap in the wall to the approach entrance, the oblique angle to the point where the lead vehicle would be at maximum vulnerability when it reached the designated forward limit of the kill zone. They pre-positioned spare drone batteries and replacement systems at their fighting positions. They established communications protocols with the infantry teams and anti-tank positions outside the buildings so that the transition from FPV engagement to direct fire engagement, which was expected when Russian infantry dismounted, would be coordinated rather than simultaneous and potentially conflicting. None of this preparation is visible in the brief seconds of footage that shows Russian vehicles burning in a factory street. But it is the preparation that made those seconds possible. The drone that struck the lead T-72 from the right flank at an angle the tank commander was not covering did so because the operator who flew it knew exactly where to position for that approach angle. Because they had spent 2 days measuring and planning exactly that shot. The simultaneous engagement of the two BMPs, two drones launching from opposite sides of the street within seconds of each other, required that the two operators involved had coordinated their engagement triggers so that the second drone was already in flight before the first strike detonated, preventing the BMP crews from having any reaction time. That coordination was established during the 2 days of preparation, not improvised in the moment. The Russian assault force that entered the industrial district that morning was not a poorly prepared formation. Russian commanders had selected the industrial terrain specifically because they understood its properties. Cover from artillery, confined engagement ranges, reduced Ukrainian standoff advantage. The infantry that screened forward before the armor entered had executed their clearance procedure correctly. The tank commander who was scanning with his thermal sight as his vehicle entered the corridor was doing exactly what his training required. The formation was coherent, it was moving, and it was doing what combined arms urban assault doctrine calls for. What it encountered was a defensive system that had been designed around the specific properties of this specific terrain by defenders who had spent more time studying that terrain than the attacking force had. Ukrainian operators knew where the angles were. Russian attackers did not know that Ukrainian operators had identified and pre-registered those angles. The asymmetry of preparation, not of equipment, not of numbers, but of terrain knowledge and positional advantage, determined the outcome. The Russian infantry that was isolated when the armor failed represents the human dimension of the engagement's failure most acutely. These were soldiers who had entered an industrial district on foot, moving ahead of armor that was supposed to follow them through and provide the fire support and protection that infantry cannot provide for itself in urban terrain. When the armor stopped and burned, when the street filled with smoke and the drone fire continued from positions in the factory walls that they could not locate and could not suppress, they faced the worst situation that urban combat creates. Isolated, without fire support, in an environment where every opening and every wall potentially conceals an enemy. The Ukrainian infantry and FPV operators who were engaging those soldiers were doing so from prepared positions in terrain they understood. The Russian infantry were doing so from a street they had entered minutes earlier. The engagement was not equal. It was not intended to be equal. Ukrainian defenders had spent days making it unequal. The industrial districts of eastern Ukraine are not glamorous terrain. They are cold in April. The factory buildings retain winter chill through the first weeks of spring. The concrete floors are damp. The spaces are dark. The Ukrainian operators who spent 2 days in those buildings waiting for Russian armor were not in comfortable circumstances. They were in effective circumstances. Positions that gave them the capability to destroy a Russian combined arms assault before it had penetrated 40 meters into a 300-meter corridor. Russia brought armor into a factory street, expecting to use the buildings for cover. Ukrainian defenders were already inside those buildings, had been inside them for 2 days, and had spent that time preparing the engagement that turned the factory corridor into a kill zone. The industrial district held, not because Ukrainian forces had more vehicles, not because Ukrainian forces had more soldiers, because they had more knowledge of the ground they were defending and the discipline and the skill to use that knowledge at the moment it mattered. Ukrainian operators held the walls. Ukrainian infantry held the exits. Ukrainian anti-tank teams held the angles. And the Russian column that was supposed to punch through the industrial district and reach Ukrainian positions beyond it burned in a street 40 meters wide, stopped before it had traveled 100 meters into a terrain that Ukrainian defenders had turned into the most effective defensive environment possible. Ukraine holds the walls. Ukraine holds the streets. Ukraine holds the ground. And the industrial districts of eastern Ukraine are still Ukrainian ground.